Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. So we're going to start on time, and as I just promised everybody at the Compliance Institute, we'll try and finish on time as well. So if you just roll on the slide, please. Just a couple of bit of housekeeping. Please feel free to use the question box, and please, obviously, the more questions, the better. These sort of events, the more discursive it becomes, it's always, I think, more informative for everyone. Just to point out, the session will be recorded and will be made available afterwards. The Compliance Institute will obviously make you aware of that. And obviously, for those of you who are looking to avail of some CPD, this event does have some CPD, and obviously there's the code that you can use. So a bit of housekeeping out of the way. My name, some of you may know me from previous webinars or other iterations in life. I'm Andrew Quinn. I'm Director at PAT FinTech. And I'm really pleased to say that we've got Caitlin Lemo, who, as you can see, Head of AML Ireland at Interactive Brokers. Can only, again, thank Caitlin for her generosity and her time doing this. Caitlin, I know, does quite a few different events with the Compliance Institute, and has also been like a really good friend and collaborator with myself over the last couple of years. So thank you, Caitlin, for taking the time to do this today. If you just flick on a slide there, please, and we'll just have a quick look, I think, at the agenda for today. There we go. So obviously myself, just a bit of housekeeping, a few introductions. What we thought would be a good idea, and the timing of this just felt like it was a very opportune time to do this, is there's just so much going on, generally speaking, in the world. And, I'm old enough to have seen a few different cycles, but it's a very kind of volatile time in a number of ways. And we thought, and Caitlin, as I said, kindly agreed to do this, that there were perhaps like three big themes that we could kind of just discuss and see how they interweave with each other. And as I said, please feel free to drop the questions in, and myself and probably more likely Caitlin will do her best to sort of deal with the questions as they come in. But we thought that, again, from a practitioner's point of view, or people perhaps even looking at, I think, the increasing strategic importance of all things AML and counter-terrorist financing, three big themes probably: the general geopolitical or even geo-economic backdrop. I mean, whether it be talking about the tragic events of Russia-Ukraine, or talking about, for the first time perhaps in a generation, real inflationary pressures and central banks being a lot more active, and obviously the impact that's had on financial markets. And you could also probably throw in recent events in the crypto world into that mix. It's been a very kind of interesting, if you like, volatile few months. Aligned to that, also ongoing, and this is probably where my side of the house falls into this, particularly ongoing, just, technological innovation, particularly around so-called regtech and regulatory solutions, and how they can help address the complexity and the more strategic elements of the anti-money laundering function. And then related to that, and I think a testament to what we're trying to do today, the central bank's recent announcements around the creation of PCF 52, obviously an extension of the existing PCF 15, which many of you in the audience may have. And, clearly that's something that's going to be a very big topic over the next few months. And obviously it's something that you may have questions around. But for me, it's really just more of an indication of how strategically important the anti-money laundering role is becoming. And obviously that's why I asked Caitlin to come along this afternoon to speak to that. Once Caitlin's finished up, and we're going to run a couple of polls, because obviously that's another interesting way to see what people are thinking around these issues at the moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I would perceive to be the increasing importance of education and training, so-called upskilling, reskilling, and I'm going to sort of just give you a little overview of some of the offerings that we at PAT FinTech have come into market, and hopefully, obviously, from my perspective, they may be of some interest to some of you. And then, look, we'll certainly delve into a Q&A. Looking forward to your questions, and obviously, we'll leave you with some follow-up links and information if you want to follow up on anything you hear today. So I think that is probably 5 minutes. So I will, Caitlin, if it's okay, hand over to yourself. As we discussed beforehand, if I see questions dropping in, I'll let you know. And as I said, we're going to try and make this as discursive as possible. So thank you, Caitlin. Over to your good self.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone, and to the Compliance Institute for having me. Pleasure to be here. As Andrew started off, there's a multitude of things from an AML operational perspective and external environmental factors that are really driving a lot of hot topics at the moment. It was hard to narrow it down. I think that the ones that we've selected just seem to permeate every institution across Ireland, and so every compliance officer and every AML analyst or every sanctions analyst is kind of feeling the impact across these areas in some way, shape, or form. And so, you know, to kick us off in the technology innovation space, we've got a poll for the audience just to kind of help us calibrate where some of you guys are at. Look, a lot of institutions are trying to get to the right solution for their AML challenges. And so looking externally to vendors, we're just interested to know at the moment, to help kick off the discussion, where your firm has landed in the last couple of months to a couple of years in terms of trying to implement some sort of comp tech, reg tech type solution. So once those answers are in, we'll give it a minute for everybody to vote, and then we should be able, if everything's working effectively, to pull those responses up, get a look at the distribution. Right.
Thanks, Caitlin.
So I think while we're waiting for those polling results to come up, you know, the challenge of, oh, excellent, here we go. So look, it looks like the majority, at least a third, haven't really started to explore any type of a solution. Now, if we had more time, we could do some additional Q&A to kind of unpack what might be the drivers behind that. But I suspect, based on, you know, conversations that I've had with colleagues and feedback from industry, it's probably a few factors, right? Whether or not the organization as a whole sees a need to invest in AML in some type of a solution. I think that we've all, you know, heard the drumbeat of AML as a cost center, right? And so if we're going to invest as a firm, we're going to do it in the business, in a strategic area, and not in compliance. And compliance already costs so much. So that could very well be a driving factor. I think that there are also a lot of organizations who maybe spent quite a lot of money on technology in a post-consent order or remediation environment. And so the idea that it's already time to start looking at new solutions can be very overwhelming. And there may not necessarily be the rationale or justification to shift gears after so much work and effort was originally put in to a new solution in that, again, in that post-consent order remediation environment. Looking at sort of the distribution between organizations that are using homegrown solutions and organizations that are currently looking to build out their reg tech solution. A lot of organizations, about a quarter of the group, look like that's something that's underway, and obviously underway means a lot of different things to a lot of different organizations. Are you looking at it from the vendor selection process? Are you looking at it from the implementation stage? The sustainability of what's already been stood up? Are you at a place where you're finalizing that customization and configuration, or are you looking at it from the end-to-end entire sort of life cycle, if you will? And then I think organizations that use homegrown solutions, it's hard to know for sure, but I might speculate that quite a few of the members of our audience are probably also falling into the service provider category. You know, we didn't have enough options from a polling perspective to have that as a drop down, but you know, I think we've got a lot. Ireland plays host to several really very good reg tech platforms, and so I imagine that to a certain extent, maybe some of our audience are falling into that service provider bucket, and that homegrown solution is their vendor. All right, can we go down to the next slide then?
Just to talk very, very briefly, Caitlin, to follow up on that.
Yeah.
One of the initiatives that I'm involved with the Compliance Institute is we're going to be launching a so-called, we're going to call it a Reg Tech Forum, you know, for Ireland. and we're going to be inviting anyone who's interested, to participate in the forum. So clearly, obviously, if you're in the audience today and you have interest in that, please let us know. And one of the things we were going to do, just to action, to sort of get it up and running, was a follow-up survey to maybe delve a bit deeper into the short survey we just did. So sorry, Caitlin, just wanted to throw that in there.
No, I think that that's a great platform to put out there. I think one of the biggest challenges that happens anytime financial institutions go to implement a solution, a vendor solution, whether it's a reg tech or anything, it's that they don't have the ability to necessarily capitalize on lessons learned from their counterparts or other organizations. The only person that you've got to be able to provide some of that perspective is your vendor, right? And as they're coming in telling you, well, this worked well elsewhere, but they don't know your business as well as you do either. And so there are limitations in that ability for them to have those insights and make them useful. So I think those kinds of forums, formally or informally, are absolutely essential. If you've got a colleague who's in a similar role in another organization and you know that they're going through this type of a process, the best thing that you can do for yourself is to reach out to them and ask them about what their growing pains were and how did they get through some of those roadblocks and obstacles, because they're going to have the best, most tangible insights for you. So on that note, what we'll hope to deliver here today is some of what I've accumulated from colleagues and friends and peers across different organizations in terms of some of those technology challenges and how they've been able to successfully work around those. As I mentioned, one of the biggest hurdles is often that business engagement. So as a growing financial institution, or even an institution that has already been spending quite a lot of money elsewhere, it's very difficult to get senior management, executive leadership to buy into the idea that investing more in a compliance solution is worth the time, effort, and energy, and that it may in fact provide value add that outweighs where that investment may have gone elsewhere from a business perspective. I think that the other challenge from a business engagement perspective is that there is sort of this fear, even within the AML compliance space, that automation or innovation means a loss of jobs. But really, I think the best thing that you can do when you're talking to the business is, sell them on the idea that it means that automation in some way, shape, or form from a solution perspective frees up your human resource capacity in order to look at the really messy, really truly risk-oriented items. And that's exactly from an ideal design perspective where you want to have your program operating in the kind of optimization that most of us are looking for. So I think that, I've talked in other sessions and with peers about this concept of agile compliance, and it's really not agile in the traditional technology programming sense where that it's a methodology that programmers can apply. It's agile in the sense that it's dynamic. It's a responsive compliance environment where you are looking at trying to get out in front of the problem and the challenge rather than react to it and kind of always be chasing a solution. I think that right now, I don't know if anybody else is feeling this way, but it can often feel like we're inundated with vendor solutions. I know I get emails constantly, probably anywhere from 50 a day from different vendor solutions saying, hey, do you need something to solve your sanction screening problem? Do you need somebody to solve, the automation and, optical character reading functionality of your passports and driver's license or whatever the case might be? It can be really difficult to sell the business and engage with your business stakeholders if you're constantly saying, well, I need that, and I need that, and I need that, or if you're trying to solve for 10 different problems at once and you're kind of always reacting. So, I think one of the things that I'm recommending from my prior experience to, again, friends and colleagues, is that we probably all need to be developing better roadmaps for where our AML program wants to go and how technology supports the successful accomplishment of that roadmap. And it really does lead well from that business engagement perspective, even into the vendor selection process, because if you've outlined where your needs are, then you're better equipped to go out and find a solution that offers a multitude of different functionalities to solve more than one problem, as compared to the latest flashy, new twist in tech and whatever that might offer you in terms of a short-term fix. And so I think that, it's not really always easy to develop those roadmaps, because you do have to work in conjunction with the business to say, what is the long-term strategy? Where do we want the business to be in 5 years? What products or service or offerings are we looking to potentially add to our portfolio? What will AML need to look like? Commensurate with that. But I think that the one huge advantage that those conversations and that activity has is that it demonstrates to your business partners that you as AML compliance are thinking forward about the benefit of the firm, that you're thinking about how do we take on that risk safely and securely, so that it helps to minimize that perception that we got to do this without AML knowing so that they can't stop us, right? Better to ask forgiveness than permission. Well, I think that this type of an approach really helps to kind of flip that mentality on its head. So another huge challenge is vendor selection. So, obviously there's always a budget, there's always cost limitations, but I think right now from an AML perspective, one of the biggest challenges that we're encountering is the AML due diligence component that goes into vendor selection. So in a lot of instances, firms will have their third-party risk management function, and they will lead the charge on vendor selection. But the challenge is always that they may not be asking all of the right kinds of questions. AML needs to participate in that process to, one, make sure that the solution is customized or meets the needs for your particular organization. But typically what we're seeing is there's a due diligence around that vendor, right? Asking questions about what kind of anti-bribery programs do they have in place, where they have sales, that is their target market. Where else do they have data servers, and is that potentially an issue? There's a huge amount of convergence nowadays in terms of AML operations and other areas of the organization that are doing these activities. And this vendor selection process is really critical for key stakeholders on the AML side to really get involved, understand what kinds of questions are being asked, work with those owners and leaders to be able to say, hey, I'd like to be able to provide input, ask these kinds of questions. And ultimately, I think that we're seeing vendors doing a due diligence on our financial institutions as their prospective clients. And so I think that there's a huge amount of workload that's coming up the pipe for AML, for heads of AML, where you're responding to a multitude of due diligence questionnaires as you try to source a vendor. So, what can really be helpful is working with your, again, third-party risk management team to understand, well, at what stage do we really need to start responding to these due diligence questionnaires? Because if you're doing a request for information out to 10 different solution providers, you don't want to be doing the due diligence at that stage. It's just onerous. It may not come to fruition. You're ultimately only going to select one system or software package, whatever the case might be. So you've really burnt a lot of time and effort and energy on doing things that are potentially superfluous. So getting some of that input from your third-party risk management function will help narrow down how much effort needs to be put into that. And then also, if you know that you're going to start sourcing a solution, preparing a due diligence package on your firm up front, that way it's sort of ready to go and you can just zip it out. We found that really handy on our side. So moving on to sort of the implementation challenges, I think the new skill set, and maybe Andrew will touch on this a little bit in his segment, the new AML skill set unicorn is that individual who can somehow both speak the programmer language and understands the AML risk and the AML operations well enough to really facilitate the development of business requirement documents, the ability to understand whether all of your transactions are coded properly or what back-end data tables need to be joined together. I haven't found that individual, so if you're out there, drop me an email. But I'm sure, like I said, we're probably all going to be fighting over that same skill set and resource. So I think the key for us across Ireland and from an industry perspective is how do we start to develop that individual in-house? If they know our organization and our systems and our platforms, I can teach them the AML piece. Hopefully, I think, not to toot my own horn, but.
If I might just actually, again, a bit of a shameless plug, it's not actually directly related to today, but just because you brought that up so specifically, another new offering that we brought out is called Applied Regulatory Analyst. And we're trying to achieve exactly what you just described, Caitlin. That they're actually small workshop deliveries where we're trying to develop that business analyst type skill set that people might have the product knowledge, but don't necessarily have, if you like, the skills to build the requirements analysis, talk to the techs the way they need to deliver upon it. So again, I couldn't agree with you more on that. And that's a really important, if you like, skill shortage that we all need to focus on developing. So sorry about the plug there, but
No, worked out well. I mean, I think, look, on the implementation side, I probably could have even put, implementation / system change management, because the challenges that you encounter from the implementation perspective are ultimately going to be the same challenges that you encounter when trying to maintain and uplift the system and make sure that, things are optimized and tuned effectively. So those two really go hand in hand. It just sort of depends on what life cycle stage you're at in terms of a system implementation. So last but not least, I think regulatory confidence. And truth be told, I kind of struggled how to name this particular challenge and something short and concise, but I think it's this idea that we're all encountering a challenge of getting our regulators on board with automation and where we want to take automation. Look, we have to always be able to prove to the regulators that we got the fundamentals nailed down, that we can do the basics. They're looking for those basics. And so, there is going to always be a gap between that regulatory expectation of how a program looks and gets executed versus where we'd love to drive our programs in terms of automation and sophistication and the things that we'd like to be able to do from an AI perspective, so that our human capital are freed up to look at some of those things that, are the items that keep us awake at night. And so I think that from an Irish perspective in particular, we have a distinct luxury to have so many vendor solutions based here that our regulators are familiar with them because they've seen them in other institutions. They're individuals who are participating in other webinars. They're, members of the local community from an AML perspective. And so we have the ability to leverage that. But there's always the responsibility that we each have, though, is to educate our regulators when they come in to do the AML examination about how have we successfully selected this vendor? How did we manage that system implementation so we know that things are done properly, that the data integrity and the continuity is there, that we've captured all of the transactions correctly? How do we know that this solution is appropriately customized to our business and product offering, our customer base? And so I think that it's not just about saying, hey, this solution will prevent identity theft and fraud because it has 100 different, databases of driver's license across Europe, so it can detect if it's been modified. It's about telling the regulator why you knew that that was a solution that you needed, how you've managed your program, how you know that it's turned on effectively, the confidence ratings that you've set for that fraud detection are appropriate and tailored to your risk exposure. And that's the most important thing that's going to get that regulator to be confident and have the buy-in in the system that you've selected and that you've done it effectively. All right, on to the next slide. So look, I think there was a part of me that was a bit torn about covering the sanctions environment. I think that everybody is probably so inundated with the sanctions issues that it's a little overwhelming to continue to talk about it. And yet at the same time, I think there's value in continuing to talk about it, just simply because we're all experiencing such an unprecedented volume of sanctions challenges that anything that we hear that could be useful for us within our organization provides some value. So hopefully I'll be able to share something that people will be able to take away this afternoon. One of the things that I've been looking at in particular is navigating multiple jurisdictions. So as a Irish entity, we're obviously following the EU sanctions and the UN sanctions, but as a brokerage firm, I have clients that are trading on the US stock exchange, the London stock exchange, and others. And so, you know, even the trading activity that that client is allowed to engage in is driven by OFAC and, you know, the UK Treasuries list. So trying to navigate what an EU client who is not sanctioned may or may not be able to do on a UK trade based on what types of stocks or publicly traded companies or other even sanctioned companies are on that exchange has been quite the challenge. And unfortunately, what it's led to, for better or for worse, I say unfortunately, it's led to a much more conservative approach, right? Because it's much easier to wholesale prohibit certain activities or certain client types than it is to try to navigate and wade through what might be kind of that gray sanctions territory. And certainly for an organization like Interactive Brokers, where we have zero risk appetite from a sanctions breach perspective, that drives all of the decisions that we've made recently around how to enhance our control environment. For organizations that are navigating these jurisdictional challenges, I think that what you really need to be looking at and discussing across an executive management level, and even, you know, whether that's your compliance committee or up to your board risk committee, your board of directors, whatever your forum might be, is to look at that risk appetite statement that may have been approved in January of last year, or who knows how long ago. Look at whether or not your sanctions controls today are going to be able to sustain whatever that risk appetite is. And if not, what are you going to do to address it? And if you think that you need to create different tiers to that risk appetite statement, say zero risk appetite for EU, maybe you want to create some gradation from an OFAC or a UK perspective, whatever is appropriate for your organization, looking and having those discussions with those key decision makers, and then creating, again, a roadmap to kind of implement accordingly. The domino effect on clients. So what I'm trying to convey here is that even as financial institutions, we're obviously very familiar with how to comply with sanctions requirements. We have list management, we have multiple maker-checker reviews of potential matches. We know what our filing obligations are. However, most of our clients are probably not in industries where that's really had an impact on them specifically before, or their business model. So, you know, recently there's been a slew of sanctions on firms that do import-export in various jurisdictions, including Russia and Belarus, and the need for those clients to then ascertain whether or not they have a sanctions impact. Let's say that they are in agriculture and they import-export certain flower seeds. They could very well have gotten swept up into the scope of these sanctions. And so in terms of whether or not our clients now expose an incidental sanctions risk exposure because they don't know how to effectively manage their sanctions risk, there's a requirement for us to, you know, report on deposits over 100K for those particular clients. How are we going to ascertain as financial institutions whether that reporting requirement is triggered? So, you know, I think that one of the things that financial institutions can be doing right now is try as best as possible to do inventories of certain segments within your client base. So for instance, if you provide trade finance services, that's going to be an exceptional place to start. For financial institutions like an Interactive Broker, one of the things that we ask clients or clients is, what is your nature of business? Import export is one of the drop downs on the application, and then they have the ability to elaborate. And we also ask questions about what are your, if you're a high risk business, what are your top 10 jurisdictions that you do business with? Now, that's really led us to be in a very solid position right now because we had those baked into our application. But if you're an organization who may not have asked those questions yet, what you need to do is look at how am I going to slice my client base in order to figure out who to target to start asking those questions. And obviously the goal is to keep the impact or knock-on effect to the client experience as minimal as possible so that you're not hitting up every single client and it's 90% useless information that's coming back to you. Easier said than done, and that's part of what I thought why I thought sharing it today would be worthwhile. I think more and more also teams are setting up sanctions investigations functions. So you have your maker checker roles for those dispositions. But even within those dispositions, it may be relatively clear that there's not a true sanctions hit. But again, you're not necessarily sure what the knock-on effect is to the organization. So for example, a lot of individuals may be employees of the European affiliate of a Russian sanctioned entity. That just means that, or even the sanctioned entity themselves, what level of seniority do they have? Are you going to offboard the mailroom clerk for Rosneft's European arm? Probably not. But how are you going to demonstrate that that was the risk-based decision that you made? Those sanctions investigations functions or that shift towards building up a couple of dedicated resources to help parse out and document those decisions, I think we're seeing those crop up within organizations. So if your organization doesn't have a sanctions investigation team yet, you may want to look at whether or not you've got capacity to throw a couple of resources into something like that. And it doesn't, again, it's being called sanctions investigation, I think, to distinguish it from that disposition activity as well as the surveillance or transaction monitoring side of the house. But the investigations piece doesn't necessarily mean that you're looking at sanctions evasion or whether or not there was a breach. It really is more about helping to investigate the scope and volume of risk exposures in line with the risk appetite. I think I'm kind of describing it to other people as more of an interim sanctions risk assessment function that's kind of real-time responding to things as they're cropping up because it is such a dynamic sanctions environment. And I think that kind of also helps kind of hit on that final bullet is sort of the enhanced scrutiny of potential matches. Look, right now everybody just needs to decide within their organization if maker checker is enough, or if you want to recalibrate what requires escalation to AML compliance for a period of time or in certain scenarios or in certain list types, while the evolving state of the Russian sanctions is really so dynamic. That way that you have that additional level of assurance that nothing's getting missed. But again, that sort of comes back to, do you have the capacity to take on those additional escalations or referrals, and whether or not something like that sanctions investigation function may be worthwhile for your organization. All right, I want to keep on track as much as possible, so we're going to move on to the last piece here, the new PCF role. So I think that for a lot of us, we probably saw it coming for a period of time, or at least we felt like our role was already so intensive in terms of the accountability and the things that we were managing on a day-to-day basis that the PCF 15 as a split role was more form over substance, perhaps. And I think that that's really important to talk about because I think that that's probably one of the primary drivers behind why this AML compliance officer, head of AML CFT, has become its own PCF role. I think that it's in some ways recognition by the central bank that the amount of work that goes into managing the AML compliance program is so essential and so critical, and it's just so voluminous that asking one person to dual hat for both the general compliance side and AML specifically is potentially too burdensome. And when you're holding that individual accountable, that's an unreasonable expectation. I also think that it demonstrates the need to make sure that the AML is front and center on parallel with the other compliance areas. I think that it may have been historically very easy for AML to get buried as 1 or 2 bullet points in a general compliance report that goes up to the various committees and executive management. This shift, this change, ensures that there's direct reporting to the board of directors for the head of AML in order to make sure that that information is going immediately directly to the tone at the top, that there's enough information being presented, that there's enough effective challenge. And it really is the mechanism to highlight just how much emphasis is being put on the importance of AML compliance, that it doesn't just get buried as part of another area. You know, I think the reason that it's probably happening now, as opposed to, you know, a year or 2 ago, or even pushing it out a little bit further, since the, you know, the European Banking Authority has provided some similar guidelines about other jurisdictions shifting in the same direction. My personal opinion is that it really boils down to the capacity and enforcement function from the central bank, right? They have a dedicated AML team. They really always have. Why would you not expect a financial institution to have a dedicated reporting line and similar accountability? I think, you know, it kind of parallels in with the SEER regime as well, from a timing perspective. And I think that the central bank probably knew that this was going to be coming down the pipe for a while. I know from myself specifically, they had given us a heads up about splitting out the role, and so they had asked for that as part of a condition of authorization. And it gave us, you know, fortunately, quite a lot of opportunity to get out in front of how we wanted the program and those reporting lines to be differentiated. And so, you know, I think from an industry concern perspective, it's a nice way to dovetail in that there is more accountability, right? It does mean that we are ultimately responsible. There is nobody between us and this program at the end of the day if you're in a head of AML role. So, you know, that can be terrifying. It can be overwhelming. But at the same time, does become quite gratifying in the sense that you don't have to buffer with other people, right? You get to level set with your audience. AML is now on par with a lot of the other risk functions and operational areas. And so it's without you having to advocate for yourself and push and push and push. The central bank has largely said, give these guys a seat at the table because this area is not going away. It's just as important as anywhere else. And at least within my management team, we've seen the convergence of AML with other areas. So, you know, our risk function, our cybersecurity function crop up more and more and more because I've got a seat at that table. Those discussions are happening and the light bulb goes off for me and I'm connecting the dots, and that those conversations become much more constructive as opposed to decisions get made and AML has to adjust to figure out how, you know, the decisions that we didn't have any party to are now impacting how we're going to manage our program. I think that, you know, what institutions, if you haven't already, first and foremost, I think you need to give some thought as to what your organization wants to do. You can keep the same individual who's now the PCF 15 and they can dual hat. You can promote from within. And actually, I think that we've got a polling question coming up here. Maybe now's a good time as any to get that polling question in. To ask the audience in terms of your organization, do you know what your plan is in terms of how to respond? I think for most of us, the responses were due to the CBI early in June. So this, you may know what they've already done, but if you've decided that if your organization decided to say hire externally, there's a lot of roles available for these for different organizations right now. And so I think a lot of places are still trying to figure out what their game plan is going to be. But the most important thing, I think, is that institutional knowledge from your current PCF 15, part of that individual's job at least for a while, needs to be the handover, the transition of institutional knowledge of the machinations from, again, those different governance functions and bodies, so that that new head of AML can learn the ropes. They can get to know their board of directors members. Those board members can get to know your new head of AML, because they need to have a rapport. They need to be able to have an open exchange and a dialogue about issues, what's being escalated up, the state of the program. The head of AML needs to know, this is what's important to my executive directors and my INEDs. And that doesn't happen overnight. And somebody is, even if you're hiring externally, they are not going to be able to just jump in and understand that dynamic. And so having that individual who, again, was your PCF 15, spend, maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a little less, maybe it's a little more, obviously, depending on your organization, but really facilitate that transition. That's going to be critical. I think that you also, it's so easy to overlook how AML fits into different parts of processes, because that individual who is managing compliance also had ownership for the AML piece. How is AML going to engage with the risk function? When you do the enterprise-wide risk assessment, how are you going to leverage the different risk functions that are happening within that team? Are you going to start utilizing some sort of, again, vendor solution that does control inventory documentation, a GRC type tool? Engaging with the team that manages GDPR, and so you've got client information coming in. Those questions may have already been asked and answered, and in almost every organization that's probably already been resolved. But if you've been, say, the deputy MLRO or the head of MLRO, the head of AML without the PCF designation, you may not have been part and parcel to every single one of those conversations, or you may not know the stakeholders and owners within your organization for those pieces. And it's going to be critical to get to know those individuals, because they're your new partners as you go forward to manage the AML program. Do we have any responses on the poll yet?
Let's see, hopefully we start to see the responses build up, Caitlin. Just give this a few more seconds. Just check if there's any questions out there. Oh, just a quick question, if you don't mind, Caitlin, just while we're waiting for that. Can you hear me, Caitlin? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Just a quick question. You may have already addressed this, to be honest. How has the CBI arrived at its determination of an in situ PCF 15 versus a new PCF 52 role?
Sure. So, I mean, there were several rounds, I think, of feedback from different organizations that were provided to the central bank as they had made the proposal for the PCF role before it was officially rolled out. I'm not obviously privy to all of the machinations and the decisions and the feedback pieces, but my understanding and from different conversations that I've had is it really boils down to the CBI has kind of been focused on the fact that the MLRO role can exist in a financial institution, let's say a fund, for instance, without necessarily having to have somebody who meets the requirements for the PCF 52 exclusively. So somebody who, however, those funds would have already had to have somebody who is a PCF 15. And they can remain the PCF 15 without having to, say, become the PCF 12, which doesn't have the dual hat designation. I think the other things that were taken into consideration were the size, the scale of different organizations. So something like a crypto platform, your PCF 15 really actually leans more towards the AML side of the house in general. That's the more dominant piece of that compliance officer's workload or scope of responsibilities. And some of the other client stuff, like maybe say asset protection or GDPR, those are more ancillary. And so the idea that you could still remain the PCF 15 and those types of organizations was my thought and understanding, is that it kind of allowed for some of that latitude in the CBI's estimation. You know, that being said, I think that the feedback and the guidance from the CBI to date thus far has been, whatever decision you make for your institution, you have to be prepared to defend it. So, you know, whether or not that's a formal exercise to calibrate, you know, role responsibilities and some sort of RACI matrix and how you're going to split that out, I don't know that that's the expectation that the CBI has. But if you feel like that's what your organization needs to do in order to stand behind keeping one individual in that PCF role as opposed to splitting, you know, the more of a stretch you think it is to keep that one role, the more I think that you're probably going to want to take on the exercise of documenting the rationale so that it's more easily defensible to stand behind. I hope that that answers the question.
I think actually the poll results probably
yeah,
sort of underline what you just said to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. I know we are just past 1:45, Caitlin, so I might just.
I'm all set. I'm going to turn it right back over to you.
No. It's a real, as expected, a real tour de force. And look, you know, as we said before, and you opened up with those remarks, it's very hard to sort of condense this, you know, into an hour or so. But look, I think that was a really good round trip of some really big thematic. And I would say, my observation will only be, particularly as it relates to perhaps, you know, the sanctions environment, and I think the technological innovation and the importance of looking at technology as solutions, and obviously the extension of PCF 15 to 52. These are not temporary things. These are thematic, strategic, long-term changes in the AML function. So again, that was the idea behind today. So thanks, Caitlin. I'll come back to you at the end. I'm just going to spend 5-10 minutes maybe. Just, you know, the obvious idea for me is, how can we help? You know, what's our role in this? And as PAT FinTech, and look, very, very proud of the partnership we have with Compliance Institute. And in particular, you know, I'm just going to mention a few courses that we have coming to market, and I'm happy to say tomorrow, any attendees of today, you'll get an email and you'll get a nice brochure with a little bit more information if you want to follow up on this. But look, we perceive ourselves as having a role, particularly in conjunction with the Compliance Institute, is trying to help develop, you know, the so-called talent, you know, that's required, you know, for everything that Caitlin has kind of just touched on. So we have at the moment a number of so-called micro credentials. So the idea here, and I'm not going to read everything off the slide, particularly if we're a little bit short on time, but the idea is that, you know, the professional, you're all, with perhaps one or two exceptions, working professionals. You may or may not be working in AML compliance or other parts of the financial services industry. But one of the challenges I face is that I have to deliver programs, not just that are designed and developed with industry, which they are, not just programs that are delivered by industry practitioners, which they are, because I'm very passionate that the programs and the courses need to be delivered by people who are actually doing the jobs, if you like. And we're very lucky to have a really good faculty, of which Caitlin may be one in the future, if you ever have a spare moment, to deliver the courses for us. And we're very committed to that. But another challenge is you're obviously all, you know, struggling like a lot of us with a work-life balance. So we have to make the programs and courses accessible. They're all online and they're all recorded. You know, we're very conscious that people can't always make a certain time slot for class. So everything is recorded. Everything, I hope, is very, you know, consumable. So access is important. And another factor is clearly the length of programs. So if you haven't heard the expression before, micro-credential is really just micro. they're micro deliveries. So some of you may have experience through your undergrad and your postgrad of doing modules, you know, like a module over 12 weeks. And you might have 6, 8, 10, I don't know, modules that stack up into a number of so-called credits, and that constitutes the overall award. So these are like micro, that's the key word. So they're like individual modules, if you like. And obviously they can have different periods of delivery. So in this case, I'm looking at AML, micro-credential, single subject certificates, as we call them. We happen to have 4 of them. They're all 10 credits, delivered over 12 weeks, 4 hours a week. But again, as I said, that 4 hours is all recorded. There is an online class every week, but it's not obviously mandatory. It's helpful if you can, but obviously everything is there for you to consume in your own time. And it's really important that the learner, as I would call you, the person who's looking to develop skills that you already have, to develop perhaps more awareness over changes that are taking place in the industry. And I think for us, a heavy influence is around what we call the fintech side of things, which really just means financial services meets technology, and it just means technology changes the way, you know, financial services are delivered. AML is clearly a core component of providing financial services, and we believe very strongly, as I referenced earlier, even with the new initiative around the RegTech Forum. And another thing we do in the class is to support that is we bring vendors into the class to demonstrate what their solutions are capable of doing, create awareness. So I think technology offers a lot of solutions that a lot of people are perhaps not even aware of. And I myself frequently remind myself that I don't know what I don't know, you know, and people don't. So I think all of us as a community, a network, an ecosystem, who believe in the importance of creating real excellence in how we perform the AML function in this particular case, you know, I think that we can come together and we can share knowledge and we can share experience. And look, again, Caitlin today, that's a fantastic example of somebody coming in and being really open source about her own perceptions and experience. And that's something we're trying to cultivate in the programs that we deliver and we're working on. If I could just perhaps roll on a slide, and I'll look to give us a few minutes for a few questions. So again, like I just said, paraphrasing myself, it's really about delivering skills-based programs in a way that offers people a really agile, to use Caitlin's word from earlier, and flexible learning environment that's really supported and is of, I believe, the highest quality, given that it's delivered by really high caliber industry professionals who are talking about the contemporary issues. And that's another really important factor for us. It has to be about now and the future. You know, we have to be looking forward. And Caitlin actually again referenced that in terms of, you know, agile compliance, in terms of getting ahead. Try to get ahead of what's coming at us. And I think, you know, that's something we try to achieve in the courses. If I can just roll on one more slide, please. Key benefits, again, look, it's obviously dependent on your own circumstance, but the idea is to offer a range. And once again, tomorrow, you'll get a nice brochure. And we have a number of different short courses. The 4 that I'm just going to touch on real quickly here are specifically AML related. But I was very taken by some of Caitlin's comments around particularly, you know, vendor, and I'd say vendor evaluation, implementation of solutions, the regulatory confidence in those solutions. If you have a quick look at the brochure, you'll see that we've got a number of other short courses that deal very specifically with issues like that. And, you know, I think they may have been of some value and interest to some of you in the audience today. I also did mention we've got another new training offering that, again, we can talk about more if you've got some interest in that. Very proud, and I was very we didn't practice this. I was very pleased when Caitlin specifically highlighted the importance of those skill sets, because that's something we see and we hear all the time from industry. So one final slide maybe from me is the particular AML courses. These are all 12-week courses. They're all starting in September. The start dates are a little varied, so please, if you're interested, follow up with questions and queries. As I said, you'll be getting the brochure tomorrow, and I'll just roll on to the final slide if I can. Just some contact information. Again, these slides will be shared with you tomorrow. So again, any inquiries, please, come back to us or come to me directly, see my email at the bottom. Check us out on the website, find me on LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff. I really do believe in the ecosystem and the network, and I believe that we can all, help each other, really execute, more efficiently and, in a more progressive, forward-looking way. So on that note, I'm just going to check if there's any questions waiting for us, Caitlin. I don't know if you had any final thoughts or observations, and I might just finish up by asking you a couple of questions unless some come in. Oh, there is one here actually, sorry, Caitlin, a bit specific for you. Does an individual have to be a PCF to be deemed in situ under the current transitionary process?
Yeah, I mean, so my Latin is quite rusty, but basically the short answer is yes. I know that's the premise, right? Is that somebody's already demonstrated that they're in the role, doing those responsibilities, and that it should continue to transition to that individual without any rationale for challenging the status quo, as it were, for that person to demonstrate that they're credentialed. That being said, in most instances, that's been where the PCF 15 has remained in the PCF 15 role, right? Where they're trying to advocate for that stance for that person to stay dual-headed. For individuals who are, say, maybe the deputy head of AML or the head of AML without a piece is just a control function, whether or not the CBI is accepting of that individual to remain to transition to the PCF 52 without having to, say, go through the questions and the interview process, I've heard of both. So it's a case-by-case basis, and it wouldn't really be fair for me to say, yeah, this is the path forward, or here's how you get there.
That's cool. And actually, that just related to that, just a question. Obviously, this transitionary process is obviously going to create, from my perspective, more and more opportunities for professionals in the AML function particularly. And just wondered if you had any observations that, something that I think even the skills report was released last week that we had some involvement with, the skill shortages out there, the real supply-demand imbalance for experienced, compliance professionals, but maybe specifically in AML roles. So again, to me, this is not a transitory thing. That there is a real requirement to try and provide the talent or find the talent. And I personally believe there's a lot of people with very transferable skills that are missing the trick, to be honest. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. We'll close it up.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. We as AML professionals have to be looking to transferable skill sets, right? We have to take on the ownership of committing to getting them trained from an AML subject matter perspective, whether that's in-house, through hand-holding, through additional coursework like your own. The idea, though, is that there is not enough AML experienced resources to go around. You cannot hold out hope for hiring an analyst who requires 3 to 5 years of experience at an entry-level salary, because it doesn't exist, right? They're not going to be there. So I think the biggest challenge, the AML professional side, we probably recognize that in our heart of hearts. We do. And it's something that logically, pragmatically, we understand. I think where we encounter the challenge is in our leadership, right? We're going to our leadership and we're saying, I've got a backlog of alerts. I can't get through it. I need bodies, right? They don't want to get consultants for a variety of reasons. They want you to hire. They don't want to spend any time and invest in getting somebody to learn how to do that job. They want somebody who can hit the ground running, right? And so that piece of it is always going to be very hard to navigate. But I think some of the things that we found have helped the most are hiring individuals where maybe their skill set isn't immediately apparent in terms of how it's transferable. So for example, we hired a young woman into a governance role, and she came from a quality assurance role. And so you may not necessarily think that there's a lot there, because that person has, in a quality assurance role, they're testing, they're not actually doing. But the luxury of that is she's seen everything. She wasn't siloed into one area of the program or another. And so you just have to get a little bit creative. And look, I think that there are other common denominators. Those people who know that their skills come up short when they're applying for a role, they're hungry, right? You're going to get them to work infinitely more hard. Well, they're going to work just as hard as anybody else, if not harder, to show you that they're ready to learn and hungry for it and want to. So there's something.
I mean, just even from my own, if you like, cohorts of learners over the last year and a half, with the focus very much around compliance with the Institute, I could name literally dozens of examples of people I know who have followed that path. They've had very strong skill sets that, with a little bit of bridging, a little bit of help, a little bit of support, I think can definitely be very transferable, and they help resolve that sort of supply problem, I think, across the industry. Listen, I have to stop myself, Caitlin, never mind anyone else. I'm really sorry, the hour flew by.
No, it's my fault. I went much longer than I should have. I got on a roll.
Not at all. I think they were here to listen to you, not me. But listen, thanks, Caitlin. Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Pleasure.
We will be following up tomorrow. And finally, thank you to the Compliance Institute. And happy Tuesday. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
That's cool.